Welcome to Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode we're going to be speaking to Dr. Zachary Ardern about science and religious belief. Before I introduce our guests though, let me just say a huge thank you to all of our supporters at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. You guys are awesome. Thanks to you, this episode was made possible. If you're not already a supporter at patreon.com, you can do that anytime you like for as little as $1 a month or as much as you'd like to contribute. Every little bit helps to ensure this great content keeps getting made, and it also gives you access to exclusives that are available only to our Patreon community. So you can do that anytime at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. Right, back to our guest. Dr. Zachary Ardern is an evolutionary biologist working as a postdoctoral researcher in Germany, where he is researching the origin of new genes in pathogens. His PhD is from the University of Auckland, where he majored in biology and also in philosophy as an undergraduate. He has been active in Christian apologetics on university campuses and elsewhere for the last 10 years, and recently has been exploring and defending the view that there is evidence for purpose in science and also in evolution. So without any further ado, let's have this important conversation with Dr. Zachary Ardern about the so-called conflict between faith and science. Dr. Zachary Ardern, thank you so much for being with us to have this profoundly important conversation, a conversation that I think is probably becoming more pressing by the day. The big question right out of the gate really is there actually a conflict between faith and science, or is this a war that's caused by misunderstandings and other things that have sort of muddied the waters?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's great to be here. And I'd say overall, there's not a war between faith and science, but there can be wars between different understandings of faith and different understandings of science. So basically, I'd say the main issues are cultural and sociological and philosophical, and not actually between straightforward science and straightforward Christian faith. But of course, there's going to be lots of perceived areas of conflict depending on how people understand each of those two things. So I'm sure we can get into some of the big hot topics there.
Yeah. It's funny because I think about often when this supposed clash comes up, and one thing I noticed, and I don't know if you've seen this, is there seems to be a lot of still what were commonly called the Enlightenment black myths, really. And one of those was that, the Enlightenment was fighting back against this evil, superstitious, tyrannical church that had no time for science, effectively considered it sorcery, and was just freeing us from those superstitious shackles. And you often get stories around, for example, Galileo, and the Galileo incident is often completely mistold and misunderstood and sort of weaponized in that way. And it seems that at a popular level, a lot of people have really bought into that sort of mythology, right, that the two are at war with each other.
Yeah, I think it's partly because science is so powerful and so important in our world that a lot of people kind of go to it to justify other things that they believe. So atheism has very cleverly, I would say, tied itself to science, or been allowed to tie itself to science in a lot of people's opinion. So when people think of science, sometimes they think of atheism or naturalism or something like that. But I just say that's a PR kind of move that the atheism has managed to largely get away with, which is really unfortunate because historically there was no necessary connection at all. It wasn't that people became more atheistic and then they became more scientific at all. The early scientists were largely Christian and doing it out of Christian motivation for Christian reasons. So it's a really strange thing that atheism is so often seen as or even anti-theism is seen as somehow connected with science.
Yeah, it's interesting, because even Bacon, the father of the modern scientific revolution, the Baconian method, he's a devout Anglican man, and there's no way I think he would have been happy with perhaps where his legacy has been used or misappropriated by some people. But even before that, so a lot of people perhaps thinks that that's the beginning of science and bringing us out of the Dark Ages. But you go back right well before that. You've even got guys like Albert the Great, who's the monk and the master of Thomas Aquinas, and some of his categories in botany we're still using today. Like there's actually a rich legacy, and I actually think it's not Christianity that rejected science. I see a move by certain scientists, like you say, who also smuggled in their own philosophical and ideological ideas into that project and then pulled themselves away from Christianity and tried to claim science was, the church was pushing away science.
Yeah, I think this whole thing just shows the power of myths and the way that we see history, and that atheists have got this picture of history that everything was dark and then it became light when someone switched the scientific atheistic light on. And that's a really powerful story that I think appeals to a lot of people. One reason it appeals to people is because it means that if you believe in that story, then you're in the smart group, you're the enlightened group. And so if you sign up to that, then you build yourself up. And I think that's a lot of the appeal of people like Richard Dawkins and others who push this kind of narrative, is that if you join my team, then you're on the good side, the smart side, the enlightened side. So there's just a lot of kind of myth making that's going on behind the scenes, and it's worth delving into what did the early scientists actually think, and what is science actually.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I see also there's a lot of moralizing now too that goes on with science, and scientific propositions are often presented as sort of moral fait accompli, and to even hold a dissenting view is to be an immoral person rather than just to hold a different idea about the evidence in question, and this is one of the things where I think it's interesting that you talked about the sort of power of myth, and it got me thinking actually about, or reminded me of when C.S. Lewis talked about science and the potential for it to be what he called the magician's twin, because, magic, when you go see a magic show, a magician makes a rabbit disappear, but they don't really do that. There's no power to do that. It's an illusion. But science can and has delivered very powerful and important things, like the eradication of polio is phenomenal. It's borderline miraculous, and so there's a real danger with that, but it also if in the wrong hands, if you like, and it's very easy to say, well, look what we've done for the world. We must be the truth tellers, and those guys are not. It's very powerful to sort of fuel that myth, right?
Yeah, I guess people are looking for priests or authority figures, and sometimes scientists kind of put in that position. I mean, certain kinds of scientists anyways, and it's not really scientists, it's more certain people who become labeled as authority figures within science, or the kind of scientists who fit the stereotypes or fit the picture. So someone like Richard Dawkins plays into that perfectly. And I think that's what he's doing basically. He's playing into the narrative that people have, and he's the scientist who fulfills all the right stereotypes, so he gets promoted as the archetype of scientists. Even though amongst scientists, he's not really seen as a leading scientist. He doesn't meet the criteria of being one of the top scientists by the usual standards of science. But for the public who buy into the myth that he's selling, he's promoted as one of the greatest thinkers of all time, and that kind of thing, which is most biologists would say is kind of crazy.
It's quite funny. I think probably a lot of philosophers would say that's also crazy, which often he's delving into more really philosophy than science, right? It's the thing you talked about. Under the guise of science, I'm actually doing something else here. Let's go into the controversial hot topic then, because one of the areas that it seems it's almost like the low-hanging fruit for very militant materialist atheists to sort of target is the question of human origins, and in particular the whole question of evolutionary theory and versus other interpretations that are commonly found, you'd have to say, within certain tenets of Christianity. So can you just give us the different Christian approaches to the question of evolution? Because the idea out there is it's just homogenous, that all Christians believe that evolution is the devil's work. They believe in a literal six-day creation, but in actual fact, it's a bit more complex and varied than that, right?
Right. So I find it helpful to think of it as a spectrum. Even sometimes people will put it into camps, like maybe three camps. Like you have young Earth creationism, that the world is roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and the days of Genesis are literal 24-hour days, and so the week was a literal six-day week. So that's one side. And then another camp is old Earth creationists, where God also didn't create via evolutionary mechanisms, but he at least occasionally created new kinds of things, but over a longer period of time. So that's old Earth creationism. And then the third option is evolution of some kind. But even these three camps, there's a lot of people who kind of sit in the middle between these different camps. So I find it's more helpful and kind of diffuses the situation a bit to delve into some of the issues where people actually differ among the different camps, and so you can fit them into a spectrum, basically. So as soon as you accept an old Earth, then there's a range of different positions, and there's not kind of a well-defined old Earth creationist position, because different old Earth creationists, or people who might use that label, or intelligent design theorists is a similar group, they would actually have different views on how much evolution has occurred. So yeah, there's a range of Christian views as to how involved how God was in the evolutionary process, to what extent God used evolutionary mechanisms.
Would the main difference there, do you think, be between macro and micro evolution? Is that where a lot of it hangs?
So that's what a lot of people who are maybe more on the creationist side would say. So even young Earth creationists would say we accept microevolution, but we don't accept macroevolution. But what they mean by that might differ amongst different people, actually. So different creationists will argue with each other as to where to draw the line as to how far evolution has occurred. So, for instance, is a mouse and a rat related by common descent? That's, for creationists, that's actually an open question, whether an old Earth creationist or a young Earth creationist. People debate about that. Or is a lion and a tiger related? Creationists will generally say yes, but there's a lot of differences between those. So that seems some kind of evolutionary thing that's happening there. And then, so creationists will tend to deny macroevolution, but what that means is, again, not entirely clear. At what level do we start calling it at macro? But they'll tend to deny, I guess, the really big body plan level changes, whereas others, there's theistic evolutionists who think that God guided the evolutionary process or was involved in some way. And I guess I lean more on that side, and I think that evolutionary processes did happen and that God was involved. But I differ from some theistic evolutionists, and I think that God really was actively guiding it, and that there's some reason to think that from the evolutionary process itself.
Yeah.
So,
And so it's interesting, because I remember reading something a few years ago, and there was a distinction that the author was talking about. They were calling themselves an evolutionary creationist, and saying that they saw that as a distinction between theistic evolution, which was sort of just, I guess, God allowed the process to go unchecked almost. Right. You've described yourself as, a believer in evolution by design. Why do you take that approach? What is it about that you think has credit and has credibility?
Yeah, so from the theological side, I guess the more I delved into the text of Genesis and what Christians have thought about that, the more I realized I think the text kind of leaves it open. There's a lot of things that I think the text leaves open as to what we can believe. So maybe we can go into the theology a bit more soon. But then from the scientific side, I think there is good evidence of common descent and creatures being related to each other. They all share basically the same genetic code, for instance. They show the kind of pattern of similarities I think you would expect if they were descended as Darwin thought before he knew anything about genetics and that kind of thing. He still had a bunch of evidences for evolution and common descent, and I think the evidence has got stronger now that we have access to things like gene sequences and protein sequences and such. So I think there's evidence for evolution, but I also think there's evidence for some kind of design or guidance, because it looks to me like the evolutionary process has to be set up really precisely in order to result in anything like human beings. And explaining that, I guess, as a whole, I've done various talks and lectures on that and things that people can find on YouTube if they want. But I think there's a bunch of reasons to think the evolutionary process looks like a setup. Either from the process itself, or at least, this is less controversial, at least in the fine-tuning of the universe and the way the universe is set up. So things need to be set up precisely in order to get evolution. I think that's not too controversial. And because of that, I would call it evolution by design.
Yeah, interesting. So is that a position that you always held, or is it something that, did you start, you talk about this being a spectrum, did you start somewhere else on the spectrum and end up there, or was this something that you always found yourself gravitating towards?
Yeah, I guess at some point I was maybe kind of a young Earth creationism, or that was taught by some people around me, a young Earth creationist. But then I was also fairly soon came across old Earth creationism and realized that that was also a live option. I didn't, I guess as a teenager, take evolution so seriously. I was quite anti-evolution because that was kind of the mood in which I found myself in terms of the stuff I was reading and hearing from people. There wasn't much sympathy for evolution, or I didn't see good reason to believe in it. But I guess the more I studied it, the more I realized, there is actually good reason. And Genesis is not really as much of an issue here as I had thought. So a lot of the evolutionists I had initially come across had really bad theology, and that also turned me off. But that wasn't uniform across. There's a range also within theistic evolutionists or Christians who believe in evolution. Some of them are very liberal, some of them are very conservative. So I guess I shifted towards a more evolutionary view, but then I still, the more I delved into evolution, the more I thought, there is actually a space here that's kind of in between that allows for still affirming design or affirming intention or purpose, which a lot of evolutionary biologists kind of really move away from that and think that evolution has got rid of the idea of purpose or design.
Tell me, that you've mentioned Genesis, because obviously that's, I think really on both sides too, those who are sort of militant atheists who want to use it as a weapon against the church, and perhaps those who would use it as a weapon against, the position, for example, of evolution by design that you would hold. How do you receive Genesis? How do you see evolutionary mechanisms and the theory itself and everything else accompanied with it? How do you see it playing into Genesis?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that the skeptics often have exactly the same reading as, say, a young Earth creationist, as a really, I would say, I guess, diehard young Earth creationist. They have the most literalistic reading you can think of, the skeptic. And I've come across this multiple times. The skeptic just doesn't have a space in their mind for something else. That it's just obvious that if you're an honest Christian, you would be, a diehard young Earth creationist. And so it's a lot of skeptics have found it really brittle on this. Like they really firmly believe in this, and this is one of the main reasons, or it's somehow tied in with their sense of what it is to be a skeptic. That the Christians, if they deny young Earth creationism or something, they're just being dishonest. They're just trying to make the data fit. But I think historically, for instance, Christians believed that the sun goes around the earth rather than the earth goes around the sun. And it was thought that there were some passages in Scripture that taught that. So there were both, around the time of the Reformation, actually, this became a bit of an issue. And there were both Roman Catholic leaders like Cardinal Bellarmine and Reformed leaders like Martin Luther, who both thought at the time, based on the science, that the sun went around the earth. Yeah. But then people began to realize that that there was good evidence for the earth going around the sun, and that Scripture doesn't need to be read that way. And now even skeptics wouldn't say, well, they really wouldn't press that point. It's obvious that these passages in the Psalms and such are poetic. And I think we're in a similar situation with regards to at least Genesis chapter 1. I think it's fairly clear that is a highly structured, a kind of almost like a poem. As a text, because there's so much structure in the text. The first 3 days parallel the second 3 days in some ways. So I'm going to mess up the details if I try and go into that. But so, for instance, on day 1, God creates the light, and on day 4, God creates the sun. Which so the idea is the first 3 days God creates realms, and the second 3 days 4, 5, 6, God creates the things that fill those realms.
That's right. Yeah.
So there's this kind of structure and all kinds of structure and symbolism in the text that at least should make us look at that and think, maybe this is not necessarily just straightforward historical narrative. In the same way that we can look at the Psalms and say, okay, look, this is not trying to teach us science about the earth and the sun. Another really important thing for me is that I think the New Testament teaches that the seventh day continues until today. So in Hebrews chapter 4, it talks about entering God's rest, and it ties it back to the rest of creation, to the rest which God had in the seventh day of creation. And so also, if you read the text of Genesis 1 carefully, the seventh day doesn't end. So I think it's fairly clear from the New Testament, also from, I think it's John chapter 5, where Jesus talks about the Sabbath. And if you read that text carefully, he's arguing that God's Sabbath has continued since creation, and God still works on the Sabbath. So then it's okay for Jesus to also work on the Sabbath. This is the kind of argument that Jesus makes in John chapter 5. So there's a couple of places in the New Testament, and I think a verse in the Psalms as well that also refers to this idea of God's rest, that suggests that the seventh day from Genesis actually continues until today. So if the seventh day is a really long time, then it opens the possibility the other days are also a long time.
Yeah.
So that's another argument.
And that's not controversial, right? Because even old Earth creationists would say, that the Yom is not necessarily a literal 24-hour period. It's just a period.
Right. So this is all, I guess, in response to the young Earth creationists. But as soon as you open up the issue of age, then that gets rid of most of the theological questions actually that people have, or at least the old Earth creationist has to deal with the same questions. So if you can ask about why was there death before sin, and the old Earth creationists will have to say the same thing as the evolutionary creationist or theistic evolutionist or such.
Yeah.
That there was this long history to the Earth, and we have fossils before humans, so it looks like there was death before sin. But we have the question: was there human death? So the difficult issues for everyone get into the question of human origins, and that's a really messy, complicated issue, and there's a bunch of different models that Christians have recently and historically suggested of how to deal with that. So I'm not sure how much we want to get into that, but just really quickly.
I think that's important. I want to talk about that because I think that one of the things that happens is that, and you've already alluded to this, there's a certain poetry to this. There are truths that are being taught, but Genesis is not written as a technical account of history. It's not a textbook either. It's not how we would write today. And if you understand, for example, Jewish poetry, you see this a lot in the Psalms, actually. You've already alluded to this with the rhyming of the days. We rhyme poetry by finding words that sound the same. They would rhyme, if you read this in a lot of the Psalms, it looks like they're repeating the same thing in different ways. What they're doing is that's how they rhyme. So you make a statement about something, and then you find a slightly different way of phrasing the exact same point. It's a rhyme. And so we tend to read this with a modern 20th century, very technical and probably scientific revolution mindset of the text, when in actual fact, it's not written that way. And I think one of the big things is the question of, okay, what about human beings? I want to ask a couple of specific questions in just a second, but the question of human beings, and it seems to me that for example, in the Catholic tradition, which is my tradition, the teaching has been for a long time that the process of evolution is quite compatible with how God could have worked, the design process, but that the soul, the creation of the human soul, was always a deliberate and instantaneous thing. It was never an accidental byproduct of evolution that a human being has a soul.
So I think it's really important that humans are made in the image of God. But so from my perspective, the whole process of evolution is purposeful. So I'm very happy with humans being particularly purposed. And that leaves open possibilities as to how was that achieved. And I think the text actually hints at this being at least an open issue, or the text leaves some openness here. So, for instance, the word for Adam is the same as the word for man in Hebrew, or the word for mankind. So, as I've read commentaries on the text, it seems like there's some ambiguity when you look at Genesis 1, 2, 3. When is it talking about Adam specifically, and when is it talking about mankind in a general sense? And this is one reason why there's some kind of openness as to so maybe God creates mankind, and then he creates a specific representative of mankind. So this is one kind of model that some Christians have, that Adam is a representative of maybe a group of humans. But I think the important thing is that God does and obviously intend this, and he makes humans specially, but that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't a process to that. There's an open question of what processes God used, but the really important thing is that God intended humans And on the other hand, if the atheist wants to really push hard on this, I would say this whole area is kind of messy. The science of this area also keeps changing. So every few months is kind of a new human fossil discovery, which kind of slightly shifts the kind of standard naturalistic picture of this. So that's one reason why I'm quite relaxed about this whole area, is that the science is obviously not fully in yet either. So I'm not going to work too hard in trying to mesh the science with theology when the science is still kind of updating and still uncertain. So I think it's fine for Christians in that situation to just sit back and go, well, this looks like a purposeful process. God was involved. Exactly how it happened, we're not sure. Maybe we'll never know. But we can wait and see until the science seems a bit clearer, until we're too definitive on the exact model.
Yeah, and the irony here too is that this is, despite the atheist tropes, the traditional Christian vision of reality has always been that we have nothing to fear from any form of truth, because all truth has the same source. And so whether it's a scientific truth or it's a theological truth, there won't be a competition because they have the same source ultimately. And I think one of the things about this whole conflict really that often erupts, and even within Christianity, around the sort of human origins, and particularly how should we treat the Genesis text, what this does is I think it actually distracts from so many of the other really profoundly important theological and I would say anthropological truths that are taught about humanity in that text. So while we're fighting about, monkeys or not, evolution or not, all those kinds of things, we miss out on things like the fact that humanity, like you talk about the image of God, male and female, he created them, the idea of their original nakedness and what that means to be naked without shame, the fall, and how this is a profound explanation for the corrupting of the human person and the tendency towards evil we still have to struggle with today. It also gives an account for suffering that makes sense of suffering, because, things were not meant to be this way. So when you grieve, that's the right thing to do. If it was just meant to be this way, then grieving is really quite silly when you think about it, because it implies that it could be another way when it never could have been, whereas Christianity says, no, it wasn't. And all that kind of stuff, and including even things like the concept of the dignity of human work comes from that text, that we are called to participate as sort of co-creators and sub-creators in various ways in the tending of the garden. All of that stuff gets lost because we're often fighting about these questions that actually are really secondary, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so it's really unfortunate if we are fighting about the definition of the word day, when we could be having a much more fruitful discussion, I think. So just quickly, I'd say that there seem to be two main, people might say there's two kind of main roots of Western society. There's science and human rights. And both of these, we can draw back to Genesis. We can make sense of these from a picture of the world where God, a rational creator, makes a rational, orderly universe, and he precisely orders it and divides it in the way that he wants. That makes sense of science quickly. And makes sense of the scientific worldview that the universe is rational and comprehensible. And human rights is made sense of by God creating humans with human dignity. So we can get these kind of core assumptions that the atheist also has typically from the text of Genesis. So that's a good reason for the atheist not to dismiss Genesis too quickly and not to just mock it regarding the word day or such. If you miss the actual big philosophical issues that Genesis is claiming, that help to make sense of the things that we believe that other cultures actually didn't believe historically and didn't have reason to believe. It's because they're missing these kind of planks that Genesis puts in place.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one thing that's funny is I actually think, ironically, the work of people like Jordan Peterson, who has actually spoken extensively on the symbolic nature of Christian scripture, and also Jonathan Peugeot, who's a Christian Orthodox iconographer who specialises, his brother actually, Matthew Peugeot, has written a great book on how, for example, the church fathers understood and interpreted the symbolic world. And I think for a lot of people that's starting to wake them up to the fact that, Genesis isn't meant to be read as a scientific text necessarily, and there is so much important richness in there that gives us our vision of reality that's not technical science, that is often lost because we fixate on those minor points.
Yeah, I think it's just really important to try and start with the main message, I guess. When reading any text or approaching any philosophy, you should critique the strongest points that they're making, or you should critique the central point. So it's really kind of petty to to go straight to the things that are obviously minor compared to the big claims that are being made.
Let's look at some of the specifics, though, because I can imagine some people might be watching this and they're wanting to push back, and they wanted to ask some of those, perhaps what you might call the boilerplate, literal creation apologetics questions that people have. So one is, before we get into some of the specific science stuff, some people would say, well, Zachary, look, doesn't this throw the whole inerrancy of Scripture into question? So how can we trust anything the Scriptures say if we don't, if we take that as not being literal in Genesis, why should we then take Christ literally with what he says?
Yeah, so that was the same worry that people like Martin Luther and also Catholics at the time had around the interpretation of the question of whether the sun goes around the earth or not, is that people were worried that, look, Scripture seems to say that the sun goes around the earth, so if we deny that, then maybe we're throwing the whole thing under the bus. And since then, we've realized we can relax a bit because Scripture is not actually intending to teach that. So in any doctrine of inerrancy or at least authority of Scripture, I think will be more helpful if it focuses on what does Scripture intend to teach. So not everything that might be interpreted from Scripture is inerrant, obviously. The question is, what is this trying to teach, I would say. And I think we can have some kind of at least strong doctrine of authority if we think that what Scripture teaches is reliable. And for me, that's the most important thing. I'd say, just to back that up, I think too, I think we probably, even the most diehard literalist isn't really a diehard literalist. So, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, for example, the psalmist tells us. But does that mean that he only owns cattle on 1,000 hills? Well, obviously it's not, right? Yeah, exactly. There's lots of cases where the genre of the text is obviously playing a big role in how we interpret it. Science, or at least observations of the world, actually help us to work out what's literal and what's not. So when Jesus says, I am the door, or I am the vine, or whatever, we know that that's not literal because of sense experience, and because of it helps us to interpret how words should be read. And the same is true of some of these other cases, that as we understand the world better, we can actually get a better sense of, okay, what probably was the intended meaning. And I think at least clearly the main intended meanings from Genesis are to do with who is God, what's his relationship to the world, what's his relationship to us, and what does that mean for us morally? Does our relationship to him? Those are obviously the big questions. And and I think also the things I said before about the length of the days and the openness that the text provides for other interpretations means that the Genesis doesn't seem like a really strong place to attack the reliability of Scripture, given that it's a different kind of text to a straightforward historical narrative.
Okay, so I guess these next two questions might be related. I think you've already really probably touched on the timeline question. Is there enough time to actually allow for the process of evolution, because obviously it takes a long time, but also related to that, what about the fossil record? Doesn't the fossil record, support an alternative hypothesis?
Right. Well, I guess the best person to ask the fossil stuff would be a paleontologist or something. But it seems to me that there is this kind of actually, a way that I find really helpful to think about it is, why did Darwin believe in evolution? And not only Darwin, he wasn't just some guy by himself in an attic who came up with evolution, but why did he convince so many other people, including evangelical Christians, Catholics, people of other... Why was this so quickly accepted by so many experts who had other religious beliefs than Darwin did? Darwin wasn't an atheist. He was kind of an agnostic. At the time of writing the Origin of Species, he was some kind of theist, actually, probably, but later became an agnostic. But anyway, he convinced these other people who were Christians of various kinds. Why did they believe it if it was just made up, if there's no evidence for it? And it's because the evidence clearly showed that there is, the bottom of the fossil record is just bacteria and simple things. And there is this gradual development that happens over time. Complex animals are only found in the top layers in geology. So just looking at the simple progression, it looks obviously like some kind of development. And that was one of the kind of simple, obvious things why people did were open to believing in evolution, and before Darwin had started to hypothesize different things or different possibilities around that, is because there's some kind of development that happens over time, and the fossil record clearly, I think, supports that. And Darwin came up with other evidences as well. But it's important to realize this is not just some anti-Christian scientist who came up with this crazy idea, but actually this became very quickly the consensus of the Christian intellectuals of the time. People at Cambridge and Oxford and such were mostly, serious Christians, and they accepted this because the evidence supported it.
I want to come back to that particular point, that moment in history for a second, and some of the other implications around it. But one other question you often get asked is, well, what about the problem of death and suffering? Would a loving God use death and suffering in a process of creation, or would that only really come about as the result of a fall?
Right, that's a really good question. And I think the way it's usually phrased, this kind of question, I think it overstates the importance of death for evolution. So technically, evolution is just about differential reproduction. It sounds really technical and kind of boring, but evolution is just the stuff that survives better and reproduces better, survives better and reproduces better. Death is not actually technically a necessary part of that. A lot of people have this idea that death is really driving evolution, and I don't think that's actually true, just from a purely, even the strictest Darwinian sense of evolution. We can talk about other mechanisms as well, but I think it's just a myth.
Do you mean in the sense that if you don't have an appropriate reproductive pairing, that line just literally ceases to reproduce and it's not fruitful, whereas the one that does has, and so it's not a matter of necessarily death being the driver, it's just an unintended secondary effect of that?
Right, yeah, it's just that death is not actually the driver. The driver is the thing that's causing evolution. It's whatever force is making things progress or become more fit or adapted. So a lot of creationists kind of present it as death as the thing that's really pushing evolution forward. And sometimes people think that this is what Darwin was saying, but I don't think that's true. So that's important. Also, the idea of evolution is all about fighting and competition. And especially in recent years, increasingly, there's much more emphasis on cooperation and collaboration and these kind of positive relationships between species, and the whole idea of ecology and things working together in a biosphere, and there's all this kind of positive feedback and positive interaction between species, which is remarkable, and evolution depends on this stuff. So evolution is not just this purely negative, brutal, nature red in tooth and claw kind of thing. Yeah. So I think that's part of it, that people just have this really negative picture of evolution, which is not actually coming from the science. It's like a metaphysical add-on, I would say.
Well, it's almost the Nietzschean influence, really, isn't it? It's the idea of Nietzsche's, the Untermenschen, Übermenschen, the strongman, the overman, the he looks down with disdain and says that we should celebrate strength, not weakness, and it seems that's probably more of a corrupting factor there, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's all these kind of philosophies and nihilistic interpretations, but the science, at minimum, the science is agnostic about these things. And some people would argue that the science actually supports a more kind of positive, cooperative view of evolution. So there's a guy at Harvard, Martin Novak, and he co-wrote, he's one of the leading evolutionary biologists in the world. He's a Christian, he's actually a Catholic. He wrote a book with an Anglican theologian, Sarah Coakley, and together they've written this book on the importance of cooperation in evolution. And he was the head of the evolutionary dynamics program at Harvard, one of the most cited evolutionary biologists in the world. And he's really impressed by the importance of cooperation and thinks from a Christian perspective that makes sense. So there are these positive things that are also going on. The question of there's two questions. The one is death driving evolution? I think the answer is no, death is not the main thing. And the other thing is, well, how can you have death at all? And that's the question that anyone who thinks the earth is old will face. And that you can also raise that against the old earth creationist. And the short answer is that I think the text just isn't talking about animal death. at most, I think it's talking about human death. And we can think that humans maybe didn't die before the fall, depending on our model of Adam and Eve. But there are some sensible approaches where human death is a result of the fall, and that's reasonable, I think. But the question of animal death, I think, is just not even being taught about. It's the God's relationship to Adam and Eve. That's the focus of the story where death comes in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point, an interesting distinction. Especially that I find that fascinating, that concept of evolutionary sort of cooperation. It to me, it speaks very much again to God, who is a divine community of three divine persons, the Trinity. And so why would we be surprised to see that, if that is the case, a community in a sense played out in a way within the very essence of creation, the material part of it,
Yeah, and these are basically philosophical things. So some people can look at evolution and can see a very individualistic kind of survive the fittest kind of brutal picture. Or someone else can look at other aspects and see the importance of flourishing ecosystems, which are cooperating and increasing in my area, in microbial. Even in microbial ecology, you find that bacteria so often are positively relating to other bacteria, that the whole ecosystem only works because things are positively exchanging resources with each other and such. And if it wasn't for that, if it was this individualistic survival of the fittest thing, then the ecosystem would collapse. It wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that particular moment in history that Darwin's in, because there is a what would you call it, an elephant in the room, if you like, and that is the question of social Darwinism. And I know people do their best to separate the two, but there is a certain marriage there that seems almost made in heaven, dare I say it, in the sense that So in his first work, The Origin of Species, there's no talk of anything sort of eugenic. By The Descent of Man, though, there is conversations along those lines. His cousin, Sir Francis Galton, is the modern father of the modern eugenics movement. There is a question here: does it seem that around the interlinking between social Darwinism and the fact that it seems so intimate and inextricably connected to his scientific theories, is that fair, or is that perhaps again not making an appropriate distinction?
Yeah, I think this is maybe a question for historians, and this is actually a debate that's kind of flared up recently. I think there was an article in, actually not sure about, in a top journal recently, there was some article about this saying that Darwin had racist views and such. And this is also a big debate, because Darwin was very anti-slavery, for instance, but he does say some things which are racist. But at the same time, pretty much everyone who was a white person in England at the time was saying some things that were racist. So this is a really messy, complicated issue. Also, it's interesting to note that there were some creationists who were also very racist, more racist than Darwin was. And because people thought, okay, God created different races and they had different superiority or whatever. So there were different kinds of creationist racism as well. So creationism or anti-Darwinism was not necessarily an answer to racism or kind of eugenic views of humanity either. So this is a really messy issue, and it's not so easy to, like, a lot of creationists will say that Darwinism is the root of racism and such. And there are some threads that you can trace. Say maybe you can trace threads to Nietzsche and the Nazis and such, but you can trace other threads in other directions as well. So it's really messy. And there were people like Asa Gray, who was a Harvard botanist who was a friend of Darwin and Darwin's main supporter in America, who was an evangelical Christian, who, as far as I'm aware, didn't go for this social Darwinian view or anything like it. So I think basically the main issues are philosophical interpretations of the science, and the science just doesn't get you these kinds of moral claims. So I tend to think there is a gap between is and ought, and that at least there's not many cases where you can, make that transition smoothly. But a lot of people make the jump without noticing that they're making the jump. So that they look at a state of affairs and they somehow get to, okay, this is the way that things should be. And evolutionary pictures, I can understand why evolutionary pictures kind of lend themselves to that. But I think it's still philosophically mistaken to make these smooth transitions from some scientific state or claim to, therefore, this is how the world should be.
Yeah.
There's lots of things there, but this is kind of an ongoing historical debate as to how closely linked is Darwin to the social Darwinians. But people who've accepted Darwinian theory have been on opposite sides of this issue since the start, and I think it's kind of going to be an ongoing debate.
Yeah, and I think it touches on another point I want to come back to in just a minute, but I think too there's the whole milieu of the whole sort of Enlightenment and really the post-Enlightenment as well that comes. All of this is embroiled. I mean, people talk about nature, for example. There's no doubt that the will to power was used as the underpinning of Nazi ideology. They modelled the Nuremberg rallies on it, the strongman, for example. But at the same time, so a lot of people know that bit, but they don't realise that Nietzsche had died before he'd even finished that work. So all we had was his notes. They were unpublished. His sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, is the one who publishes them. And we also know that Nietzsche was fiercely opposed to anti-Semitism. So it's highly unlikely he would have supported that. But there's a complexity of what's going on. And really, in many ways, this goes back to C.S. Lewis with the rise of scientific and technical power that we've never had before, that's actually racing ahead of or has separated itself from a sacred order which gives moral frameworks in which that power sort of should be exercised. And so, Darwin, his theories get dragged into that, whether he intended that or not, right?
Yeah, and I think just mentioning the Enlightenment is also really interesting, because a lot of people assume, the Enlightenment, that must be a time of moral growth as well. But a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers were extreme racists and extremely misogynistic. So people who say, whereas Christians were kind of pushing against some of these things. So it's really not this kind of simple black and white science and good liberal progressivism on one side, and religion and bad regressive stuff, negative morality on the other side. There's really this is really complicated, and people will pull threads that they like, and also when they tell the historical story, they'll focus on the bits that they like and ignore the uncomfortable stuff.
This brings to an interesting point, really, and that is the question of natural theology. How do you think natural theology, I guess first of all for our listeners who might not be familiar with that phrase, if you could just give us a quick definition of how you see that, and also why do you think this could be helpful in the current debates?
Yeah, so going back to how we interpret Genesis and what we can pull out of that, I think so natural theology is, what can we learn about God from nature? Can we learn anything about God from nature? Some people will say, no, we should just rely on revelation. We should just rely on Scripture, or maybe we should just rely on tradition or the teaching authority of the church, or maybe personal experience, but nature tells us nothing about God. Whereas I think the historic Christian position has been that God is also revealed in nature, because God created nature. Nature tells us something about God. It doesn't tell us everything. We're not going to get the story of salvation from nature, but we could still get some of God's attributes. And I think this is clearly taught in a few places in Scripture. I think it's taught in the Psalms, that the heavens declare the glory of God. It's taught in Romans chapter 1 that people are without excuse because they know God's I think his wisdom and power from the created things. And I think actually throughout Scripture there is this idea that I actually see a sequence that you can know that God exists from nature, and you can know some moral truths as well from conscience and from universal experience. And so there is this common kind of morality as well, or some natural law maybe. And then we can progress logically from that, and then God has revealed himself. We know God personally because he has revealed himself personally. So this is really useful because it's particularly useful today because science has such authority for atheists and for skeptics. So that means that things that come from the natural world and our study of the natural world are seen as particularly authoritative, whereas revelation is seen as very suspicious and dodgy and questionable at the least. So getting into this whole area of natural theology is, I think, really important for the church, and it's a real pity that a lot of theological traditions have kind of distanced themselves from natural theology, and it's seen as kind of just like I've heard people say it's just logic chopping, or it's just that's somehow unhelpful. There's just so a lot of people think no one comes to God by argument. That's a common thing, and I think basically that's wrong. That the New Testament tells us that we should seek to persuade men, that we should try to persuade people, and that's what Paul was always doing. He was in the public using things that they could understand from their background, whether it was Jewish or Greek, and trying to persuade them that God exists and that he has revealed himself specifically in history. Yeah, so that was a long blurb, but
that's good.
Natural theology is really important because it can, if it's real, if there are real arguments from nature, then that's really useful for the skeptic and the atheist. It's throughout Christian tradition. So there's many church fathers and such who say things like, if you come across a skeptic, basically you can persuade them by the order in the universe.
Yeah.
There's lots of these quotes from the first few centuries of the church. So it's not a new thing. This is another objection. That's just this kind of trying to mix science with scripture. It's just this modernist thing, and people didn't used to do it. But actually, this is the consistent witness of the church, is that you can know that God exists from nature itself. And that's why these arguments like cosmological argument and some kind of design argument, though we need to be careful there in light of modern science, but if we can give these arguments, then that's useful.
It's interesting, actually, because Edward Fazer, who is a philosopher, he wrote, I think, what is probably the best refutation of the new atheist movement, called The Last Superstition. And one of the interesting points he made in that book was he said, guys like, for example, William Paley, who did his best to sort of try and push back against sort of the evolutionary atheistic tide of the time, he said there was a mistake they made, and the mistake was they bought into the mechanistic view of the world, which was sort of becoming the norm. And in actual fact, he said that's not the traditional Christian view of the world. And so as soon as you agree to the mechanistic view, then all of a sudden you have to reduce God to being little more than part of the mechanism somehow. Whereas if you embrace the fullness and you sort of look back, and he talks about, like, for example, the Thomistic and Aristotelian tradition, and even that vision of reality that sort of stems from that, really natural law is a huge part of this. Then all of a sudden you can have a conversation that doesn't exclude one or the other, and you don't get stuck in God of the gaps, for example, which it seems that often a lot of people end up arguing without even realizing that's what they're doing.
Yeah, so I guess I would take a different philosophical approach than Fazer would. Mm-hmm. So I'm less skeptical of this. I'm a fan of kind of the tradition that Paley's in, the kind of Victorian era natural theology. They did some really amazing stuff. A lot of the kind of early founders of modern science around the time were deeply involved in this kind of natural theology stuff. And I'm less worried about this mechanistic. The mechanistic view is not going to be the whole view of nature, but it's useful for science. And so so Ed Fazer is very skeptical of things like intelligent design. Yeah. And I understand why that is. And I think scientifically there's big problems, but some of the philosophical things I wouldn't go that far. So that's just to say that there's actually diversity among Christians on these. And there's different kinds of natural theology, I guess. So there's the kind of Aristotelian Thomist approach, but then there's also other different approaches that were more popular in the early modern era, like a little bit later with William Paley and such. And there's different ways to do it, but I think there's a bunch of these arguments that are successful And some of these arguments, I think you could spell it either way. It doesn't actually matter too much.
From an atheist perspective, wouldn't they want to respond and say, well, hold on, Darwin has killed all of this natural theology and biology, so isn't that game over?
Yeah, that's the standard picture. You often hear that even in like biology 101 lectures or something like that, that people used to believe in design, and William Paley was kind of the high point of that. Darwin read Paley and refuted it, basically. I can understand why people think that, but the argument for design is, firstly, the argument for design is much bigger than the question of biology. So actually, if you read the early Christian thinkers who talk about this, as far as I've seen, they don't actually talk about biology that much. They usually talk about the order in the universe. So for them, what's really impressive is the cycle of the seasons and the regularity of nature. And I think that's still true. The big point that's really impressive is the whole cosmic scale order. And that's only got more impressive in recent years when we've realized how big the universe is. That the same laws of nature that holds here in my room hold, 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 light years in that direction is really remarkable, and needs some kind of metaphysical principle of order underlying that. And I think the best explanation for this kind of cosmic order is God. So that's got nothing. Darwin obviously says nothing about that. He actually found that kind of thing really persuasive. There's a quote from him where he said, sometimes when I think about it, I'm a theist. When I think about basically the comprehensibility of the universe and the order in the universe, there's a quote from him where he talks about that kind of thing. And he thought that was the most persuasive argument for theism, and he thought it was a really serious argument. The question of whether Darwin gets rid of natural theology from biology specifically is a good question, because I think it does get rid of some of the kind of creationist arguments, obviously, that if Darwin's right, then some of these creationist things are obviously wrong. But it doesn't get rid of, I would say it just pushes the question back, actually. And I would say that even if you have a fully Darwinian picture of evolution, if you're going to result in something like human beings, that picture is going to need to be fine-tuned. You're going to need to set up the process in a very specific way. And you can picture this easily, that you can write a computer program that will kind of simulate evolution. But the vast majority of computer programs you might write are not going to simulate evolution of something like the human brain. That's just obvious, because the human brain is so ridiculously complicated. And Richard Dawkins says something like, there's a lot more ways to be dead or not alive than to be alive. Like being alive is a really specific thing. And getting this kind of complexity requires really specific fine-tuning, basically, I would say. So yeah, I think that whatever Darwin does is probably just going to push the natural theology back a level to why is evolution set up this way rather than another way.
It seems to me, just changing tact a little bit here, that science right now, or certainly perhaps you might say the reception of science, and certainly the Western culture, is in a state of crisis for lots of different reasons. I think some external and obvious things, some internal issues as well. But often people, certainly in popular culture, they sort of fixate on the problem of science and Christianity, sort of Christianity, if you like, imposing itself on science. But in many ways, I would say a lot of what we're dealing with now is really the danger of science without a sort of a sacred order, if you like, detached from any greater metaphysical truth, is I think why we're seeing a lot of this crisis sort of that we're grappling with now. So, for example, I think about what some people call woke ideology, which is really just postmodernism. And it poses particularly serious threats to science, for example, because it rejects science as a meta-narrative. And some people are trying to push back against that and saying, well, we need to go back to the Enlightenment. But the reason we get postmodernism is because the postmodernists actually see failures of the Enlightenment project, and they see things like what happened in World War I and the Nazi Holocaust, and they recognise that, well, science can do wonderful things, and it can also do extremely atrocious things. Like there's no way that the Nazis would have been able to commit wholesale genocide like they did on that scale without the scientific revolution. And so it's not enough just to have science. So how do we perhaps then, I guess, if you like, I almost see like Christianity has an obligation here to save science, But to do that, we've got to avoid the sort of the other extreme of sort of, I guess the extreme we see a lot more now is trying to elevate science above its own capabilities. Like you've talked about the is versus the ought, and elevating it above its sort of inherent sort of limitations. So that's one extreme. But how does Christianity perhaps, if you like, help to restore science to where it should be without embracing errors of its own in the process?
Yeah, there's heaps of things there, obviously.
Yes, sorry, that was a long question.
No, so it's just really important to try and think about these things clearly, I guess, and to really distinguish between the moral questions and the scientific questions, for instance. Like a lot of the ideological things that are currently pushed, I'd say it's interesting because they're making really strong moral claims. So that's different than a postmodern view that you can't make any claims, but it is tied with a kind of. So I would say there's a lot of suspicion of institutions, basically. One of those institutions is science. Obviously, there's suspicion of the church, maybe especially the Catholic Church, but it's the institutional church in general. There's widespread, like, we don't trust institutions. So there's that, but there's also this high regard for science. So some people are really questioning science, and some people are kind of really leaning into science and saying, no, this is the last institution we can trust. They don't even see it as an institution. This is just facts.
Yeah.
So maybe one helpful thing is seeing science as an institution. I think that's really helpful because it is a body of people. Like the university is another institution, or academia, or government is an institution, or even just as a body of people, like communities. These are like bodies of people, and these are all good things that we should try and protect, I think. And just seeing them as kind of flawed bodies of people is helpful. And science is one of these, but it has a good method. Which works a lot, and I think it works because God has made a rational, comprehensible world. So Christians can ground science and can explain why it works. So Christians are in a really good place, I think, to be in the middle and say, science is trustworthy when it's done well and carefully with the right checks and balances, and we should be aware that there's always flaws, so it's not going to be perfect, but it is a good, reliable thing. We shouldn't. We don't need to dismiss all institutions. Science is one example of something which does produce good fruits. It produces medicine and vaccines and therapeutics and it produces technology and all these things. It produces all these good things, but it has a grounding which the Christian faith can make sense of. And I think maybe we can do similar things with like government and society and laws. Because a lot of people are just skeptical of everything. But if we keep going down that route, then we become skeptical of laws. Then we have anarchy. If we really think that there's no authorities in life, that's really dangerous. Society just breaks down. And Christianity can, I think, be... I think it's a really important role for Christians in society to be against extremism on both sides. I guess I'm interested in that, having lived in Munich for the last few years, which was the area with the Nazis rose to power. And Christians kind of failed, unfortunately, there. But there were some counterexamples and those counterexamples were based on their Christian faith, where they had a good grounding that could help them reject the extremism on both sides, which was available. And I think that's just one of the roles for Christians in society is to basically be kind of a mediating, sensible voice that can make sense of some of the good institutions that we have in society. Yeah. So, I mean, there's lots of things that could be said there. Some people are maybe treating a kind of a naive view of science too high, but a lot of people are dismissing science, I think, without good reason as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think in some ways, I think there's got to be that Christian sense of wonder that really underpins the science, the progression of science in the West, in the modern world, is in many ways is lost in a cloud of nihilism. Like you say. And the reality is, I think that like science can produce amazing technology and power for us. So, for example, it can produce nuclear power, but it can't tell us whether or not it's morally right to use it to power a city or to drop a bomb on a city. That's a whole different question. And I think a lot of people now, I don't know about you, but I get the feeling that, for example, I think new atheism is really is on life support at the moment, and so it's an opportune time for people to perhaps to come back to that truth and say, well, look, Christianity sees beauty, it sees wonder, it wants to study the world, but it wants to take power and make sure that it's morally constrained and always put at the service of the most vulnerable, because that is the truly heroic and good thing to do.
Yeah, I think new atheism is really on the decline because people see it as just another group of kind of arrogant people claim to have authority, arrogant old white men who so they see them as kind of having the same errors that they would think that they would ascribe to religion, basically, that this kind of authoritarian imposition onto the world. And I think it's an opportunity for Christians to say, some of these things that the new atheists were saying were good, that they thought that science was good and that superstition was bad. And Christians can agree with that, but we can do it in a hopefully more humble way and we can say we want to direct these things, not just science for its own sake, but science for the good of society, for human flourishing. And these are things that Christians can promote and be focused on.
On that very Aristotelian note of human flourishing and at the good of the person, which is great, just to finish with a couple of different categories of recommended reading, do you have recommended reading, first of all, for people who might be people of faith, religious believers, Christians, who want to explore this topic, and you think, what's some good, meaningful works that can help them to perhaps expand their thinking around this question of faith and science?
Yeah, there's so much there. There's a guy called Alistair McGrath, who's a professor at Oxford, who's written a ton of books. I've only read a few of them, but everything he writes is excellent on this thing, I think. So he approaches it from a really historically informed view. So a lot of his work was in intellectual history. And so he can trace the rise and fall of some of these different philosophies really helpfully, and gives a really nice context for Darwin, for instance, and some of the Christian responses to Darwin, which are really sophisticated. So we can get people who want to go into this seriously can learn so much about how the Christians in the past respond to these things. Most of these issues are not new issues, actually. We naively assume that they are, but most of these questions have been discussed for hundreds of years. And smart Christians who are smarter than we are have already given really solid answers to a lot of these things. So Alistair McGrath is one example of someone who digs into that. There's so much to say. A good example of the Christian who does really well in this area is Simon Conway Morris. He's a paleontologist at Cambridge who's written on evolutionary biology from kind of a Christian perspective, but he's very highly regarded amongst biologists as well. Yeah, so that's for the Christian, and maybe for the atheists.
Yeah, that was my next question was, what about someone who's non-religious who says, well, I'm a bit skeptical, convince me that what you're saying is just not some dodgy interpretation to get away with, not having to face a fatal flaw in your religious belief.
Yeah, again, there's so much there, but there's a really nice book that I think is underappreciated, which is called Atheism's New Clothes. It's by a guy from Northern Ireland who's a physicist and philosopher, and he just covers all the bases really well in a really readable way. So that's one example. But so it's kind of written as a response to atheism, but I think it stands alone just as a nice positive case for it. Just gives the natural theological arguments really precisely and carefully and in a readable way. So that's one example, Atheism's New Clothes. I think the main issue for these things is, I would say, basically the philosophy of science. So if someone has too high a view of science, or really either a too high view of science, or just a really materialistic view of science. So a lot of scientists have a really naive view of science. They haven't really thought about what science is, why it works, how it works, or how it's different from other things. So there's a book called, I think it's called Beyond Matter, but it's by a guy called Roger Trigg, who's a British philosopher, one of the leading British philosophers, and a Christian. But it's not written. You wouldn't know. He's not explicitly Christian or even theistic in the book, but he's just explaining really carefully why we need to go beyond matter to account for science. What are the philosophical roots of science? And I think if you read that carefully, you can pretty soon see why. Implicitly, theism makes so much sense of these things he talks about. Like, why are there laws of nature? Why is there order in the universe? Why is it comprehensible? These kinds of things. So Beyond Matter is a really short, nice book, which is the introduction to the philosophy of science, basically. And I think, most kind of new atheist stuff would disappear if people were a little bit more nuanced on the philosophy of science.
Dr. Zachary Ardern, all I can say is thank you. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I know it's we're at completely different time zones, so I'm grateful for you for making the time and making it work into your schedule, which I know is busy, and also we're in two different worlds effectively. So just a huge thank you. It's been a real blessing and a privilege to be able to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll get on and do some science in a few minutes.
Thanks, mate. Bless you.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. Oh, the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright.